Welcome back. Glad that you're with us as we now continue on in our history books, looking at 1 Samuel last week. We're going to take a look at 2 Samuel this week, and that gets us started into our 1st and 2nd books. So 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And when we, especially when we get into 1st and 2nd Chronicles, we'll see why we have, or we'll talk a little bit as to why we have 1st and 2nd Chronicles where we have it in our Bible, is in the Hebrew Old Testament, they have it in a different spot, and there's a reason for that. So that's just to whet your appetite as we continue on. But tonight, let's go to 2 Samuel, and we'll continue on with our journey. We looked at three main characters last week, right? When we were in 1 Samuel, we looked at Samuel, Saul, and then David. As we go into 2 Samuel now, we're just dealing with one king. Just one king, and that is King David. So as we talked about by way of introduction last week, we said that 1 Samuel continues the history of Israel, right? From the point of the Judges, or it continues the history of Israel from the point where Judges leaves it. Okay, so that continues on our history lesson with regard to the nation of Israel. What 2 Samuel now is going to do for us is it describes the enthronement of God's king. The people's king was Saul. God's king was David. Remember, he was after his heart. Okay? David was after God's heart. So, that's what 2 Samuel describes for us. The enthronement of God's king David and the establishment of what is called the house of David. And you'll find that phrase from here on throughout the Old Testament. And he's even talked a little bit about, or that phrase is used a little bit in the New Testament to describe, again, God's covenant promise that he makes with David, because it's through the house of David where the Messiah, Jesus Christ, would later come. It's in this book, 2 Samuel, where we see God making a covenant with David. And what that covenant is, or another word for covenant, is promise. God makes a promise with David. And so as we go on a little further, we'll see what that promise was about. So, 1st and 2nd Samuel, basically what they do for us is describe the Davidic kingdom, what we would call the Davidic kingdom of Israel. All right? And that would include some of Solomon as well, all right? Because he is part of the Davidic line, hence being part of the Davidic kingdom. But all 2 Samuel, we're dealing with one character only. We're dealing with David. So that's what makes it perhaps a little easier to remember the content of the book. So let's take this book of 2 Samuel, 24 chapters in this book. And basically what we do is we take the book and divide it into three major sections, all surrounding David. First of all, we're going to talk about in the first 10 chapters the successes of David, okay? And talks about the glory days, what we would call the glory days, the glory years of David. And then basically smack dab in the middle of this 2 Samuel book, just 2 chapters covers the factor of David's sin. And this is where major disappointment comes, right? As you're reading through the first 10 chapters, everything is going well. The plans of God along with David are going well. There is a tone of excitement, a tone of anticipation of what else could happen, right? What else could go on? How else could the kingdom even flourish even more, right? And then, we come to a major letdown, a major disappointment as we read chapters 11 and 12. And David's sin is not only recorded for us, but exposed. And then the rest of the book then talks about the struggles that David has. Again, remember, David confesses his sin, but he still has to deal with the consequences of his sin. And so the chapters 13 through 24 will talk about the struggles of David and his kingdom. Now this makes this portion of Israeli history, this portion of the Bible helps to make the Bible distinct from all other books that you would find that talk about the glory years of their kingdoms. All right? The Davidic kingdom talks not only about the successes, but also talks about the failures. Okay, and doesn't hold anything back. We'll talk about the failures in a stark way, so that it's unmistakable about the failures. You read the history books of other ethnic nations. You read the history about other kings and the glory years of the dynasties and all the rest of that, and you find very, very little talked about with regard to the negative or the downside of the leaders of those dynasties. Here is what makes the scriptures distinctive in the fact that as they record the history of the Davidic kingdom, they not only talk about the positive, but they also talk about the negative and talk about how God deals with the negative. So that's what makes the Bible distinctive from the other things. Now, when we were here last week and when we were talking about 1 Samuel, we dealt with the background of both 1 and 2 Samuel at the same time. Remember that? So we're not going to take time this week to deal with the background area. What we're going to do with 2 Samuel is we're going to go right into the prominent subjects, all right? So that we can get right down to the, shall we say, the nitty-gritty of what we do at this level. Remember, we don't drill down. We're just kind of skimming right across the top of the surface to give us a bit of an idea of what the book is about. So I would say this. There are 4 ingredients that are given prominence in this book. 4 things that, as we remember those 4 things, that will help us again with the content of what 2 Samuel is about. Because remember, 2 Samuel is about a king, right? And that king's name is David. Still regarded by Orthodox Jews. Still, if you go to Jerusalem today and you want to talk about King David, their eyes will brighten. There will be a smile on their face. They still talk about the king, God's king, right? And 2 Samuel shares that with us. But we're not only talking about a king in this book, but we also need to talk about a city. This is where the city of Jerusalem now gains center stage in God's history. Because it will be King David that will conquer the city, all right, and claim the city to be the headquarters, the central location of the Davidic kingdom. This is where the temple of God is going to be built. This is where you will meet God. It will be in the city, Jerusalem, a city that, by the way, topographically is set on a hill, right? A city that is seen in the topographical nature of the Holy Land. Jerusalem is seen from far off, okay? That's what David does as he establishes the city. This will be the headquarters for the king. This will be the headquarters for God, so to speak, as the temple will be built. But remember, David is not the one who builds the temple. Do you remember who it is that builds the temple? His son Solomon, right? And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go. This book also talks about a covenant as well. We find this basically in chapter 17. Right in the middle of David's struggles. In that section of David's struggles, chapter 17, we will see God will make a covenant with David. He will make a promise. And this was the promise, that there will never be a person in his family line, I should say it this way, that the throne of David will never cease to have a person on the throne that will be from his bloodline. Okay? This is the line that Jesus the Messiah will come through. This is, and Jesus the Messiah will be the final king on that throne. All right? As it goes throughout its history. So, here's where God makes this promise to David. His kingdom will be an eternal kingdom. All right? And so this is where we are introduced to this idea. A kingdom, as we talked about, it's an everlasting kingdom. That's what's going to make this kingdom different from all of the other kingdoms of the world. There's been all kinds, prior to David's kingdom, there's been all kinds of kingdoms. Not just Saul's, but as you take a look at the nations round about them, there are all kinds of other kingdoms. Even when the children of Israel were in bondage to Egypt, they were under a particular dynasty of a particular pharaoh in the kingdom that he was in charge of. But all of those dynasties, all of those kingdoms, eventually, as with human life, passed off the scene, right? But God makes the promise to David that it will be his kingdom that will be eternal. Okay? Even now, as we are waiting for the culmination of the kingdom, right? God's promise remains. It is an everlasting promise. It is an everlasting kingdom that God promises to him. So, 2 Samuel introduces us to that factor, and those are basically the 4 ingredients that we mix in to this book. The highlights of David's reign, 2 Samuel talks about. But let's remember, what it talks about in 2 Samuel is not exhaustive. In other words, we don't have all of the details. the writer of 2 Samuel, whoever that was, remember, we're not quite sure who it was, but they don't give us an exhaustive list of the content and the highlights of David's reign. We're just talking about some of those things that would be noteworthy. Other events of David's reign are found in the book of 1 Chronicles. So if you want to do a little project between now and when we get back together, if you want to do a little project, it's interesting if you read 2 Samuel and 1 Chronicles at the same time. Because what happens there is 1 Chronicles fills in some of the things that 2 Samuel leaves out about David's reign. Okay? So you can get a better or a fuller context of what David's reign was like from both 2 Samuel and 1 Chronicles. The temple and the covenant. Here's another prominent subject of 2 Samuel. It's interesting that God refused David's offer to build him a home. It was David that came to God and said, I have a nice palace, but I've noticed you still have a tent. And I don't think that's right. And so David comes before God and says, this is what I want to do for you. Since what it is that you've done for me, I feel I need to do something for you. And what David wants to do is he wants to build a temple. In fact, has plans drawn up. In fact, begins to collect materials to be able to build this temple that he wants to build God. And as David brings this offer to God, it is God who says, no. I appreciate the offer, but it's not going to be you, David, who will build my temple. It will be your son who does that. And what's interesting here is that even though God refused David's offer to build him a home, we find that God wanted to build a house for David. Talking about, again, his dynasty, the house of David, the line, right? Isn't that interesting as we take a look at that? And the so to speak, the irony that's involved in it, right? David wants to build a house for God. God says, no, I want to build a house for you. All right? And what we see there, again, is another glimpse into the character and the nature of God. Now, the reason why God refused David's offer is because he said of David, you are a man of war. Okay? You're a man of blood, you're a man of war. That wasn't a phrase to put David down. That was just the characteristic of what David's kingdom or Davidic reign would be characterized by. Because remember, Saul still had not completed all of the commands that God had given, right, with regard to the annihilation of the nations. They were still dealing with the Philistines, right? They were still dealing with other nations. That was since the time of Joshua. That was since the time of the judges. And what David is going to do is he's going to be the one that brings the kingdom finally into its state of peace. Okay? Whereby the conquering of the peoples is finally done, is finally taking place. David will be on the throne, and he will bring peace to the nation. It's only going to be after peace is brought to the nation that God will say, now is the time for my temple. Okay? So that's why God refuses. He says to David, you're a man of war. That's what your reign will be known for. Your son's reign will be known for the reign of peace. Okay? And that's the time to build the temple. So that was the reason behind the refusal for David's offer. So what God does then is he reaffirms the covenant he made with Abraham. As he does this with David, what he does is he goes right back to the time where he made his covenant with Abraham. Now, do you remember when God made his covenant with Abraham? Do you remember what book it was in? Genesis, exactly. Genesis chapter 12, to be specific, is when it's recorded for us where God makes his covenant with Abraham. So as God makes his covenant with David, he goes all the way back and talks about the covenant they made with Abraham and how God, as he kept his promise with Abraham, the track record will prove itself, right? If I make my promise with Abraham and I kept my promise with Abraham, and he did, then of course this promise that I'm making to you is going to be an everlasting covenant, an everlasting promise, because the same character, The same God who made the covenant with Abraham is the one that's making this covenant with David. And that's, again, why we talk about this kingdom being a everlasting kingdom. Because it's going to be the kingdom where Christ comes. Remember what God said to Abraham. It's through your seed that all the nations of the earth will be blessed. Whoever blesses you, I will bless. Whoever curses you, I will curse. Okay? That gives us the dynamic of the relationship that God had with Abraham. Same kind of thing with David. All right? David is part of the Abrahamic seed that God promised way back in Genesis chapter 12. All right? So it's just continuing on with that whole history. It's easy for us to see now because we have the record, right? We have the record in front of us. It's easy for us to see now. But when God was making that promise with Abraham, I'm sure Abraham was wondering, how does this happen with one child? How does this happen with one child? Well, we see by the time we get to 2 Samuel, and God makes a promise to David, we're not talking just about one child now. We're talking about an entire nation. An entire nation that is finally coming to the promised land that God promised for them. Way back when they were released from Egypt. So, what David does, since he is not going to be able to build a home for God, what he does is he prepares the materials for the temple. Now, when you read that portion of 2 Samuel, that becomes a very interesting part of what goes on. In fact, 1 Chronicles gives us in more detail with regard to the preparation of the materials. We find that David, as he's getting the materials together, has to get the people to stop giving. Because there's just so much. There's just so much that we're brought in. And it's not a case that the king put out an edict and said, okay, from here on now, a certain percentage of your income is coming in to the coffer so that we can get the materials to build a temple. That wasn't how it was done. As David communicated the idea of building a temple for God, for the people, as they would worship God, they are amassing him with all kinds of materials. Solomon will be involved in that as well. He will make particular contracts with particular nations. Lebanon will be one of them, and the cedar groves that would be there. He would make a contract with them, and they would cut down all the cedar trees and bring them in, and all the rest of that, and get the wood all ready. But this preparation of materials is a remarkable read as you go through it, and kind of gives us a challenge, I think, with regard to, okay, if the people are that devoted to what they would do for God, what does my devotion look like, right? And so it's a good read. But of course, with all of this, and all of this is a good tone, it's a positive tone, things are going well, right? We're excited about what could possibly happen next in the kingdom. We have to deal with David's sins. Now it's interesting. Out of the 24 chapters, only 2 chapters deal with it. Okay? But again, the rest of the book will deal with David's struggles as a result of this sin. This is what we would call a tragic turning point in David's career. Everything was going well. But we come to this tragic turning point. And what's interesting, too, about his sins is that, notice, it was committed at the height of his reign. It wasn't while he was going through a low time. It was while he was going through a high time. In fact, the writer of 2 Samuel helps us to understand that, how all of this started was that David was in the wrong place at the height of his career. Because what Samuel does, as we go into chapter 11, as we begin chapter 11, is he talks about the fact that, we're now in the time of year when kings go to war. Okay? It was battle season. And by implication, what the writer's saying is, David should have been at the site of the battle. But rather than doing that, because of the power and because of the influence and because everything was going so well, David decided, for whatever reason, that he didn't need to go to the battle. The battle would take care of itself. He doesn't really need to be there. And so he finds himself at home. And when he finds himself at home, he gets distracted. And the rest, as they say, is history. Not only does he see, as we all know, not only does he see a beautiful woman who is a married woman who was not doing anything wrong. To bathe on the roof of your house was something that was normally done. Why? Because it kept you hidden from the street level. All right? So that you could bathe in peace and in privacy. So Bathsheba wasn't doing anything wrong. It was David who was in the wrong place. Because remember how 2 Samuel makes that implication. At the time when kings are at war, okay, he wasn't in the proper place. He got distracted. Lust got the best of him. He, as we know, he takes Bathsheba, he lays with her, and now as he finds out that she's pregnant, now we have to try and cover up the sin, right? And so if you know the story, you know that he calls Bathsheba's husband Uriah in from the front lines, and figures if we can get Uriah and Bathsheba together as husband and wife. Remember, he's been on the battlefield for a while, so they've been missing each other, and all that has to happen is that, get Uriah and Bathsheba sleeping together, and then we can say that Bathsheba's child is Uriah's child, and everything will be taken care of. But what does Uriah do? Because of his devotion to his king, the night that he's brought in, where does Bathsheba sleep? She sleeps in her own bed. Where does Uriah sleep? At the door of the house. When asked for an explanation, Uriah says, "Why should I sleep in my own bed when the soldiers that are under my command are sleeping at the front lines? It wouldn't be fair to them." And so his loyalty, his devotion, and all the rest of it come shining out. Well, plan A didn't work, so now plan B, and it becomes even more of a heinous crime when David gives instructions to his commanding officers to make sure that Uriah is on the front line, and make sure that when the battle is heated, that any backup for Uriah is taken away so that he will be killed in battle. All right? No one needs to know. No one needs to know. Between the time when David falls into his sin and the time when Nathan the prophet comes and points his bony finger at David's nose and says, "You are the man," we estimate about the time period between his sin with Bathsheba and the prophet coming and confronting him was about a year and a half. Okay? So imagine that, 18 months. 18 months of knowing in your own heart, in your own mind, what has happened, and what you've done, and the guilt and the load of that guilt, right? That would weigh on you for about 18 months. And how it would, as you're going longer and longer into that 18 months, how it's getting heavier, and the burden's getting heavier, and the burden's getting heavier. It's no wonder when David was writing about some of this in the Psalms, where he talked about the heaviness and the weight of what he was enduring, how his bones had grown old, that God was basically crushing him and pushing him down, right? Why? Because we need to deal with this. Remember, you're my king. You're the one who is devoted to me. You are the one that represents me to the people. Right? You're the king that's after my heart. We can't have this. The relationship has been broken. And so when you read some of the Psalms that David writes, especially during the time of his sin and during the time of the exposure to sin, David becomes quite poetic in describing the oppression that he felt himself under for about a year and a half, okay, was the length of time there. And we find that what happens is that David basically was never the same again after this. God does not take his kingdom away. Remember, he promised him. Okay? But David would never be the same again. Notice as we look at verses 10 through 12 in 2 Samuel 12, this is what God is saying to David through the prophet Nathan. "Now therefore the sword shall never depart from your house, because you have despised me and have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. Thus says the Lord, behold, I will raise up adversity against you from your own house, and I will take your wives before your eyes and give them to your neighbor. And he shall lie with your wives in the sight of his son. You did it secretly, but I will do this thing before all Israel, before the sun." And it was true. It was despairing true. But all that David did in secret, what happened to David after this, and what would happen with his wives, and what would happen with his concubines, and what would happen with his kingdom, would not be hidden from the people. It would be exposed. Exposed to the fullest degree. TMZ had nothing compared to what was going on here. All right? Or the National Enquirer, or whatever. Okay? God would expose all of this, and David would have to live with this for the rest of his days. I often wonder, and maybe we'll have a chance to talk about it someday when we're in eternity together, but I've often wondered how many times David in his mind during those years would say, I would give anything to be able to turn back time, right? To be able to go back and make the right decision rather than the wrong decision. I'm sure that there were many times that he was lamenting the decision that he made. And that's why the last portion of 2 Samuel talks specifically about David's troubles. Again, he will never be the same. He's having to deal with the consequences of his sin. And even his own son Absalom will rebel against him. He will lose his son Absalom to a death in the pursuit because he was a fugitive after Absalom tried to usurp David's authority and take the kingdom for himself. We know what happened to the child that David and Bathsheba had in their adulterous relationship. They lost their son, which is always a devastating thing when that happens. But what's interesting, again, and that again is just an example of the character of God, the king that would take over from David, that would be Solomon, who was Solomon's mother. Do you remember? Bathsheba. And so we find God in his grace and his mercy. What does he do?
Follows in line.
Yeah. The line continues, the promise continues, but isn't it interesting how Bathsheba now becomes involved in that line? Because remember, she was the wife of a Hittite. Okay? Ruth was a Moabite, Boaz was a cousin, or not cousin, but Boaz was a son of Rahab, and now Bathsheba being married to a Hittite. The blood, in spite of it all, the bloodline continues. And so, basically what happens now is, as we read through 1 Samuel, we see the ups and downs of what happens with obedience and faithfulness and disobedience and unfaithfulness with Saul and all the rest of that. So there's things are starting well with Samuel, things go well, but then we have King Saul, things go well at the beginning, but they don't end up very well. Then we come to King David, and we get excited again about the exciting things that God's doing, and we come to the height of David's reign, and what happens again, we're let down, right? By the time we get to the end of 2 Samuel, we're almost spent in our emotions because we've been on these high highs and we've been in these low lows. And especially as we get into the last part of 2 Samuel, we're into that low low. But what's going to happen as we go on is we're going to find that we'll get our hopes up again as we continue reading. Because after David's reign, who comes on the scene but Solomon, right? And we'll start to get excited about what happens there. And when we get into our next section, when we come back again, we'll see how our emotions begin to climb again as we deal with King Solomon. But with all of this, what's happened with 2 Samuel, we come again to that all-important question, right, that we've been asking as we've been going through. And we ask the question for this book as well. We ask the question, so what? Here's the so what. Here's the bottom line in 2 Samuel. God's timing is the best timing. God's timing is the best timing. What do we mean by that? Well, let's remember, David waited for God to crown him as king. When Saul came onto the scene, remember what was happening. The people were pressuring Samuel the prophet to find them a king, because they wanted a king like all the other nations round about them, right? But what David did is he waited for God. When Saul finally lost his reign in the the eyes of God and told Samuel, "Go find my king." Where did David find himself when Samuel was looking for him? Out the back fields of the ranch, right? Tending the sheep as he'd always done. The youngest of all the sons of Jesse, right? And it was God who confirmed through Samuel who the next king would be. David was the one who waited for God to crown him as king. After Saul's death, David still did not immediately assume the throne. There was some work to be done. By the time that Saul's death came to be, David had his own followers, and David had a little bit of his own kingdom, but he didn't have it all yet. He didn't have all of Saul's kingdom. And after Saul's death, David even waited for a little while before bringing those kingdoms together. It was, for all intents and purposes, a bit of a split kingdom, all right? But David would bring all of that together, and that's where Jerusalem would come into play, to being the headquarters of the Davidic reign and the worship of God. God's timing is the best time. This isn't the first time, of course, we've seen this in the Old Testament. Probably the first time we've seen this is when Moses tries to do for God what he thinks he's called to do. Remember Moses' first attempt at trying to free the Israelites from Egyptian bondage, where he beats up and actually kills an Egyptian slave driver, and this was going to be the revolution. And Moses just slinks off in the night into the backside of the desert, right? It wouldn't be until some 40 years later that God would say, "Okay, now's the time." Same thing with this. God's timing is the best time, and I think, especially in our day and age, we need to be mindful of this. Remember the day and age in which you and I live. We live in the days of immediacy. Things are instant. I don't have to wait now for something to cook. I can pop it in the microwave and it'll be nice and hot in a matter of mere minutes, if not seconds, depending on what it is that I'm cooking, right? You remember the old days when there were no microwave ovens, and when we had to make dinner, it was the case that we had to use that big thing that's in our kitchen that looks nice because we never use it. And maybe it took an hour or an hour and a half to get separated, right? Remember the days when we could go to the television and turn it on and then go back to the kitchen and fix something to eat or drink? Why? Because we were having to wait for that silly thing to warm up before we could even watch anything. Where now I just sit down on the couch, press a button, and boom, I've got my picture instantly, right? We live in a day and age of immediacy. We want things now. We're not necessarily willing to wait for God's time, okay? And 2 Samuel reminds us of the importance of waiting for God's time.
It means we think if God doesn't do things immediately, that He's doing the work in us to prepare us for that time that is perfect.
And we get impatient.
Yeah.
We get impatient, and then we wonder why it doesn't work. Well, the reason why it doesn't work is because, one, we're not ready, and secondly, it's not God's time. And so then we get frustrated and all the rest of those things. God's timing is the best time. But here's something else. God's leading is the best plan. I think that's something that we need to remember as well. Isn't it interesting? And you'll see it as you get into 2 Samuel. After Saul's death, what does David do? He doesn't immediately go headlong into now bringing about all the plans of bringing everything together under his authority. But what David does is he consults God first. And he asks the all-important question. Okay, now what do we do? What is the next step? What do we need to do now? Well, when we think about it for a second, Saul's dead. Who's king? Well, David's the king. I mean, he was anointed before Saul was even dead. David knows that he's the one chosen by God to be king. So what are you waiting for, David? Just go ahead and do what it is that a king does. No, David doesn't do that. He goes to God first and says, okay, as you know, things have changed. Now what do? I'm wondering if Solomon picked that up from David. Because remember what Solomon did after he took on the reins? What did Solomon do? He went to God and says, all right, I know you're willing to give me anything. Because God said, whatever you want, I'll give it to you. And rather than doing that, what Solomon does is says, okay, I need wisdom to know what to do next. Okay? I wonder if Solomon picked that up off of David. His dad. Okay? In the sense of rather than going headlong and figuring out whatever plan you think is best, what about God's plan? Well, that's the best. And sometimes we need to take the time to consult Him, indeed, on what to do next. Here's something else I think is important. Peak times can be dangerous times. Peak times can be dangerous times. Not that we want to avoid peak times. No, we like the high times of life, right? We like those. We like that time of life. When things are going well, things are tickety-boo, things are sailing, and things are going in the direction we want them to go. But that's when we need to be careful. Because sometimes what happens during the peak times is we drop our guard. And that's what David did. He dropped his guard. And, as we know, he fell. We need to be cognizant of this, that peak times can indeed be dangerous times. David's fall occurred during the peak of his reign. Sometimes when peak times are going, we get a little bit lazy, or we get a little bit cocky, we might say, right? We think that these things that we've accomplished, we have accomplished on our own. And that's sometimes when we get tripped up. David is a great example for us about how to be careful during that time. Here's, you've often heard what you reap you will sow, right? Or what you sow you will reap, right? Notice how I put it here. What you reap, you will sow. What you reap, you will sow. What do we mean by that? Well, when you make a decision for a particular action, when you decide to go a particular way, when you start to bring in that which you have prepared, that which you are doing, you are going to be continuing to sow into the next times, into those next generations, right? For example, here's what I often say to a young couple who are planning on getting married. They're not married yet, they're in the engagement period, and now they're wanting to get married. And what I will often say to them is this: all right, the things that are happening for you now in your dating relationship, understand that you now need to make, if you haven't already done so, you now need to make some decisions. The things that you don't like happening in your dating relationship, you need to stop. Why? Because you'll carry that with you into your marriage. And if you don't want that in your marriage, then what you need to do is you need to stop that now in your dating relationship. What you reap, you will sow. The things that are going well are the things that you like about your dating relationship. Continue to strengthen those and continue to do those so that you will bring them into your marriage. What you reap, you will sow. We find the same thing happening here for us in 2 Samuel. Right? What did God say to David, especially after he fell? And even after David went back to God and said, yes, I have sinned before you. I have no one to blame but myself. I agree with you that this is wrong. And I need your mercy, and I need your forgiveness. But what did he have to deal with? Even after the confession, even after the forgiveness, he was still reaping and sowing. How do we know that? Well, when we go on into 1st and 2nd Kings and we look at the reign of Solomon, we find that some of the things that David struggled with were the exact same things that Solomon struggled with. What you reap, you will sow.
Isn't that what you, like that tells my whole lifetime right there.
Uh-huh.
Exactly.
Right.
And when God's leading when he wasn't leading, the plan was never good.
Mm-hmm.
Peak times, I've had many peak times in my life, and every time I got the peak time and things were going good, I became too complacent,
Uh-huh.
or became too much of a smart aleck.
Uh-huh.
I thought, well, I can do it, or it went this way, and when reap you sow is the same thing. It explains your life.
Explains a lot, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, and what it forces us to do, I think, is acknowledge, again, all right, who's driving the bus, right? Who's driving the bus? Is it me or is it God? And why do I find myself in the ditch? It's not because of God. It's because I've wrenched the wheel away from his hands again, right? And what you reap, you will sow. So, yeah, basically what this book does for us then is really reveals for us the heart of all people when you get right down to it. And how, again, we need to be careful. David is a great example for us. David is a great example for us. And still, even with all that happened, it's interesting how David is still so revered. And I'm not saying that he shouldn't be. But isn't it interesting how, even after all that has taken place, how David is so still revered? I think that is, again, something that God does. Right? Because we've talked about this before. God isn't looking for perfect people. Right? He's looking for people who will be faithful. Who will come under his authority. Who will allow him to lead and guide. Well, there were great times and wonderful times when David indeed did that, where he followed God. But there were times when he did not, and he paid dearly for not doing it. But yet, we will find, as we continue on our study, God keeps his promise. He promised David, your kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom. And so when we get back together again, and we get into all that has taken place after David, we'll see how God continues to keep his promise. Right up to the time when there will be talk of a birth. The birth of a king. And as we've been talking about even around here on Sunday mornings, and they will call his name what? Emmanuel. God with us. Well, that's 2 Samuel. When we get back together again, we'll dive into 1 Kings, and we'll have some fun there. Let's pray. Again, Father, we thank you for your word and how it shares with us so many good things. So many things to remind us of life and what life is like when you're at the helm and what life becomes when you're not. David is a great example for us in that area. And Father, we thank you that in the preservation of his history, you have not only preserved the good things, but you have also preserved the things that are heinous, so that we can see, we can hear, we can understand again just what depths we can go to when we decide to go our own way rather than following your way. Father, thank you for this time together. Continue to encourage and challenge as we continue to understand you